Hello and welcome to the Modern American Museum. In this short video, you will learn some background information on John F. Kennedy and his impact on America both politically and culturally, before you are free to explore the exhibit. John F. Kennedy was the 35th President of the United States, a Democrat, and the first president to be born in the 20th century. Born to a family of wealth and politics, Kennedy proclaimed in his inaugural address that the torch had been passed to a new generation.
Forget today that we are the heirs of that first revolution. Let the word go forth from this time and place to friend and foe alike that the torch has been passed to a new generation of Americans born in this century, tempered by war, disciplined by a hard and bitter peace, proud of our ancient heritage.
Described as a leading man by Norman Mailer, Kennedy was vibrant, vigorous, handsome, and young, only 43 when he took office. Kennedy fought in World War II and returned home a naval hero in 1946, after he saved his crew when the boat he commanded had been rammed and sunk by a Japanese destroyer. Before running for president in 1960, JFK had served 3 terms in the House of Representatives and was elected to the Senate in a landslide in 1952. Despite his overwhelming popularity in the House and the Senate, his record as a legislator was not impressive. Although Kennedy's style and youth appealed to many Americans, he achieved only a narrow victory over Nixon in the election of 1960, winning by 118,000 votes out of a total of 69 million votes that were cast. JFK had mixed success in the South, but ran well in the Midwest and Northeast.
Well, now we are at about 11:20 Eastern Standard Time, and the computer shows that the projected popular vote is precisely what it projected or estimated 3 hours ago, 48.9 for the Republican, 51.1%.
When elected in 1960, Kennedy surrounded himself with young, highly intelligent officials who operated in foreign policy during the Cold War, known as the best and the brightest. The best and the brightest included Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, age 24, who had been assistant professor at Harvard and the whiz-kid president of Ford Motor Company. While Kennedy had been depicted as a picture of perfect health and physical vitality, he had suffered from scarlet fever when he was a child and had almost died. Therefore, he spent most of his early years stuck in bed. JFK had severe back problems that worsened because of World War II, and after the war, he was diagnosed with Addison's disease, which caused adrenal insufficiency. He required daily cortisone shots as treatment, but the disease was thought to be terminal at the time. Kennedy survived, but was constantly in pain, and as president required lots of bed rest and frequent physical therapy swims in the White House pool. As a Democrat, Kennedy inherited the New Deal commitment to the social welfare of America and typically cast liberal votes. He had pro-labor sentiments and endorsed the Cold War policy of containment. JFK had criticized Eisenhower's foreign policy as unimaginative, saying that he had missed chances to reduce the threat of a nuclear war with the Soviet Union and had weakened America's standing in the Third World.
Kennedy began to understand that there were the limits to American powers abroad. There was a period of time when nation building in the Third World became a necessity. He showed himself to be cautious and pragmatic in foreign policy. He proved himself willing to initiate dialogue with the Soviets, and he sometimes used his brother Robert as a secret back channel to Moscow. Kennedy, in help with a peaceful revolution, set out to help nationhood with aid at improving agriculture, transportation, and communications. In 1961, to spur economic development in Latin America, Kennedy thus saw the creation of the multi-billion-dollar Alliance for Progress. In that same year, Kennedy created the Peace Corps, dispatching thousands of American teachers, agricultural specialists, and health workers. The Peace Corps embodied the idealistic can-do spirit of the 1960s and Americans' long pursuit of moral leadership in the world. Kennedy sought to counter anti-Americanism and defeat communism. Kennedy and his aides considered themselves supportive of social revolution in the Third World. The administration also relied on the more insidious concept of counterinsurgency to defeat revolutionaries who challenged pro-American Third World governments. The Alliance for Progress was only partially successful. Many foreign people welcomed the U.S. economic assistance and craved American material culture, but they resented interference by outsiders. Throughout 1961, there were Soviet-American tensions brewing. In June of 1961, there was a summit meeting with Khrushchev in Vienna. It went poorly when John F. Kennedy and Khrushchev disagreed over the preconditions for peace and stability in the world. Topics of nuclear weaponry and nuclear bombs were important to Kennedy, who saw a test ban as a prerequisite to preventing additional nations from getting the terrifying weapon. Because of this disagreement in 1961, the U.S. military budget shot up 15%, and by mid-1964, U.S. nuclear weapons had increased by 150%. In mid-1961, Khrushchev increased tensions by demanding an end to Western occupation of West Berlin and a reunification of East and West Germany. In August, the Soviets built up a concrete and barbed wire barricade across the divided city to halt the exodus of East Germans into the more prosperous and politically free West Berlin. This was known as the Berlin Wall. The Berlin Wall inspired protests throughout the non-communist world.
Leader of the Soviet Union, Mr. Khrushchev. For 2 days, we met in sober, intensive conversation. Mr. Khrushchev and I had a very full and frank exchange of views on the major issues that now divide our two countries. I wanted to present our views to him directly, precisely, realistically, and with an opportunity for discussion and clarification. This was done.
The assault has begun on the dictatorship of Fidel Castro. Cuban Army pilots opened the first phase of organized revolt with bombing raids on 3 military bases. 2 of the B-26 light bombers then seek asylum in Florida. On the heels of the air raids, landings were effected by rebels at several places on the Cuban coast, and the rebellion against the red-tinged dictator was on, with the refugee pilot claiming a full-scale army revolt near.
Kennedy was particularly rankled by the growing Soviet assistance to the Cuban government of Fidel Castro. The Eisenhower administration had contested the Cuban Revolution and passed down to the Kennedy administration a partially developed CIA plan to overthrow Castro. Kennedy approved the plan of the CIA, and the attack took place on April 17, 1961, as 1,200 exiles landed at the swampy Bay of Pigs in Cuba. But there were no Cubans there to greet them, only troops loyal to the Castro government. The CIA did not succeed. Embarrassed by this attack, the CIA hatched Operation Mongoose to disrupt the island's trade, support raids on Cuba from Miami, and plot to kill Castro. The U.S. also tightened its economic blockade and undertook military maneuvers in the Caribbean. Joint Chiefs of Staff sketched plans to spark a rebellion in Cuba, followed by an invasion of U.S. troops.
Even though the Cold War was believed to be the nation's biggest struggle at the time, civil rights was coming up right behind it and demanding the national government to support its success. In 1954, the Brown v. Board of Education Supreme Court case ruled separate but equal in public education to be, in fact, unequal and unconstitutional. Several years after this decision in 1960, desegregation had barely begun in the South, thus starting the sit-in movement. It started with several young men sitting at an all-white counter in Greensboro, North Carolina, and it continued with mostly college-age students sitting at Jim Crow segregated lunch counters. Nearly 70,000 students participated in this movement. Helping organize it was a Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or the SNCC, who were dedicated to nonviolent protest. In addition to the sit-ins, members of the CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, a racially integrated group called the Freedom Riders, purchased bus tickets for a trip through the South. The buses were firebombed, attacked by white mobs, and the riders were beaten in the process. The police did not help because the riders were known as troublemakers, messing with the Jim Crow laws. This made Americans see the discrimination in their nation, but Southerners scorned the federal government for attempting to change their lifestyle. This public awareness on the issue of civil rights pushed Kennedy into taking some action. In Alabama, federal marshals safeguarded the riders, but in Mississippi, they were arrested, showing Kennedy's wavering commitment to civil rights. In 1962, the epitome of brinkmanship was shown in the Cuban Missile Crisis. Khrushchev, the Soviet leader, secretly deployed missiles to Cuba because he and Castro, Cuba's leader, believed an invasion was coming after the Bay of Pigs invasion. Khrushchev believed the placement of missiles would even the balance of Soviet nuclear power and prompt Kennedy to leave Berlin altogether. The president became aware of the problem after a spy plane photographed the missile sites, and he organized the executive committee to address and resolve the issue. The advisor of the ExComm, as it was called, proposed a naval quarantine of Cuba. After Kennedy addressed the nation and deployed U.S. warships to surround Cuba, Khrushchev offered the missiles to be withdrawn if the U.S. pledged not to attack Cuba. The U.S. agreed, and Khrushchev withdrew the missiles without consulting Castro in case the Cuban leader decided to take further action and provoke the U.S. again. The U.S. secretly planned to remove missiles from Turkey, which Khrushchev had asked of them in his letter stating his compromise anyway. Overall, Kennedy handled the crisis well, proving him to be an effective Cold War president. Relations between the Soviet Union and the U.S. improved afterwards, resulting in less confrontation in Berlin and even hopes of the Cold War drawing to a close.
JFK was sympathetic to the civil rights movement, which wasn't agreed by many Southerners. Due to this, JFK appointed 5 strong segregationists to the federal bench, delayed the executive order to forbid segregation until 1962, and let the harassment of MLK and other freedom riders continue without interference. By 1961, freedom riders appoint Martin Luther King Jr., who followed a nonviolent strategy. As the civil rights movement grew, the civil rights gained the attention of the nation and the Cold War world.
I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream.
In 1962, 500 U.S. Marshals are told to guard James Meredith, the first African-American student to attend the University of Missouri. Despite that, 2 men were killed and 160 were injured when a mob broke out. Later, King and the Southern Christian Leader Conference knew that to gain more attention they had to plan something big. On May 2, 1963, they marched into one of the most racist cities, Birmingham, Alabama. With children as young as 6 fighting on the front lines with police dogs and high-powered water guns against them, Kennedy demanded a settlement making civil rights at the front of his agenda. With the governor of Alabama, George C. Wallace, promising segregation forever, Kennedy televised an address on June 12, 1963, telling America to fulfill its promise. Hours after the speech, civil rights leader Medgar Evers was murdered in front of his children in Jackson, Mississippi. JFK asked Congress to approve of the passing of the civil rights bill that would end the segregation in the U.S. within the next week. On August 28, 1963, 250,000 Americans come to see the passing of the Civil Rights Bill at Washington Mall. The March on Washington was for jobs as well as for African American freedom, showing their triumph over the fight for civil rights. In the summer of 1964, 1,000 students joined freedom projects in Mississippi. The MFDP, or Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, is formed as well. White volunteers took influential positions in interracial relationships, which caused many volunteers to be arrested, shot at, bombed, beaten, and even murdered. Kennedy's campaign promised to eradicate poverty, restore cities, guarantee health care to the elderly, and provide the children, but most of his agenda wasn't accomplished because he didn't have the political capital to support him. Kennedy also focused on the economy and American space program, in which he vowed to get man on the moon by the end of the decade. By February 1962, astronaut John Glenn orbits Earth in Friendship 7. On November 22, 1963, Kennedy was riding through Dallas, Texas when he was shot by dishonorably discharged serviceman Lee Harvey Oswald, who was also trying to gain Soviet membership. Oswald was later shot by nightclub owner Jack Ruby. Lyndon Johnson is later sworn into presidency using Kennedy's memory to push through ambitious new legislation.